Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Sun Seng, and I am the CEO of Teach for Malaysia. And this plenary session, Plenary 3, is on learning and innovation, a catalyst for nation building. And we have an extremely esteemed keynote speaker and lineup of panelists here to speak to us about this today. Before we dive into it, just a reminder that there is a poll that you can answer and respond to, and there is also the Q&A tab where you can send your questions in, and that's where we'll be taking your questions from. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram. He is the senior advisor at Khazanah Research Institute. He's a prominent Malaysian economist who really needs no introduction. So I would like to invite Prof. Jomo to kick us off with the keynote address. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Sun Seng, and thank you to Yayasan Sejahtera for kindly inviting me to join you today. Today, of course, is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and it's what I would like to do over the next few minutes is to share with you some thoughts I have on a number of issues. The topic which has been given to me is a rather unusual one for a day dedicated to poverty eradication, namely learning and innovation, catalyst to nation building. What I would like to do, is to emphasize, to tell you a number of stories which I think have morals implicit in them, and to share with you a different view perhaps of innovation than the one normally conveyed by discourses on, for example, intellectual property and how important intellectual property is for innovation. It's useful for us to remember, for example, that the greatest innovation in Malaysian manufacturing history was actually the refining of palm oil. There was no dedicated, specialized refining of palm oil in the world. Europe would refine vegetable oils in different ways. And what Malaysia did with the transition to palm oil in the late 60s and the 1970s was to develop a capacity to refine palm oil. And within a decade, by the mid-80s or so, Malaysia was actually at the forefront with the most efficient and most successful palm oil refiner in the world, both palm oil from the husk as well as palm kernel oil. And this breakthrough was blocked basically by Europe through a series of efforts which economists refer to as tariff escalation, raising the barriers to entry of refined palm oil into Europe. Now, the basic, the thing which was really amazing was that this was done completely by Malaysian engineers who were learning by doing, essentially, not buying blueprints from Europe or elsewhere, but really learning by doing. And Malaysia, of course, produced a great deal of palm oil and refined palm oil, but this was no longer possible. It was no longer possible to get into Europe, and so Malaysia developed what were called barter trade arrangements with countries such as China. Actually, China was the last. India first, the Soviet Union at that time, Pakistan, and then China. And so it found ways which were relevant in those days. But today, those are no longer relevant because most of these countries, perhaps except for Russia, no longer have foreign exchange constraints. Now, it's useful to remember also that we have lost our leadership in terms of the production of palm oil. Indonesia, for example, has developed dwarf oil palm trees. This will enable people to continue to harvest oil palm from trees, the natural life of which is around 80 to 90 years, as opposed to around 25 years when most oil palm trees in this country are cut down because they get too tall and are very difficult for harvesting to continue at that stage. Now, the other major development, of course, is biodiesel. In fact, I still remember that in the 1980s, people like Tan Sri Augustine Ong and Tan Sri Yusof Basiron, at that time the leadership of PORIM, the Palm Oil Research Institute of Malaysia, were already announcing the development of biodiesel. But it is now the Indonesians who are pushing biodiesel far, far more. Now, it's very important to remember that there was a deal made among the rich countries of the North Atlantic region around in the early part of this century. And in 2006, the US went the way of bioethanol and increased maize production, and Europe went the way of biodiesel, mainly from vegetable oils. And so there was a huge opportunity there. But unfortunately, because of a high degree of protectionism, which we are all quite familiar with, it was no longer possible to go in. Now, that's my first story, and then I think there are very important lessons to be learned. The most important thing is that the technological development was done through local innovation, learning by doing, sharing knowledge, which I can go into some detail about if you're interested. The second story I have is basically about what China did after Beijing Olympics in 2008. They created an International Poverty Center and gave one of the dorms for the athletes to the International Poverty Center. And I was happened to be there coincidentally for International Poverty Day, and I was asked to advise on what could be done in China. I told them straight out that I knew next to nothing about the conditions determining poverty in China. And but I said, what are the problems you think you are facing? And they told me that, for example, children of poor parents usually in remote regions just didn't go to school at all. And for them, this was the major problem. And so I said, why don't you entice them to come to school by giving them a school? I suggested a breakfast program, and you could get dietitians and others to determine what kind of diet to give to the children and so on. Now, 4 years later, the minister was stepping down as Xi Jinping was about to become the new president, and I was there again for International Poverty Day, and he gave a very nice lunch, and he praised me for all the innovations which I had suggested to the Chinese. In fact, half of them I didn't recognize at all. Is typical Chinese, Chinese meaning referring to China here, modesty, in the sense that they were giving me credit for things I had not suggested. For example, the school breakfast program. They didn't have a school breakfast program. And so quietly later, because I didn't follow the speech in Mandarin, I asked somebody there what the minister had said. And he said, well, that you were responsible for the school lunch program. I said, I don't remember ever having suggested that, but what did he say? He said, why do you have the school lunch program? Well, I asked them, and they said, well, if we gave the children breakfast, they came to school, had breakfast, and went home to help their parents on the farm right after that. And so they didn't achieve the intention of my original suggestion. Instead, they said by having them come to school, go through school for half a day, and then you have the prospect of lunch at the end of that day. People were better off. And he said, the minister, among other things, said that children in the poor areas were actually healthier than children in middle-class regions in the major cities. And the two main reasons for that. One, that they had very, very frugal but very healthy diets, because these were planned by dietitians. And there was the elimination of non-communicable diseases which are related to food. And also the food was safe, because the parents wanted to make sure that the food was not full of toxic chemicals, which many of them couldn't even afford anyway. And this was the result of this. So the children were actually much, much better off compared to the urban children, who were spoiled not only by their parents, but often by their grandparents as well. So you have 6 people spoiling one little emperor, as they used to be called. Now, I think this is something there's much to be learned from this experience. And I think we have to be humble in terms of our experience and what we think we know. And let me move on to something else, which I think has become a bit of a problem. There has been in recent decades a tendency to look at everything as capital. We have human capital first, invented about half a century ago, and then you had the whole notion of so-called natural capital, which has become very popular recently. I have a serious problem as an economist with the idea that all these so-called capitals are fungible. And this actually leads to very disastrous consequences. So you have a situation, for example, where people, for example, cut down their trees because they think there's natural capital, and then invest, let us say, in education or invest in something else, infrastructure perhaps, and they think that all of this is productive and so on and so forth, not recognizing that in many ways that if you reduce everything to capital, everything becomes fungible. It seems very, very, very good. But in fact, it is creating problems and it can become quite disastrous. So I think we have to really get away from money metric indicators. If say half a century ago, we had a poverty rate which was, say, in those days slightly over 60% in peninsular Malaysia, and that was on the basis of a certain amount of income, but you also have a lot of things which were basically provided, for instance, by government. And now many of those things are no longer available. Now you have to pay for many of these services. So we are often not comparing like with like and taking the simple consumer price index as a basis for comparison, or worse still, so-called what do you call it? The McDonald index and things like that is really not very helpful, I think. Now, we have to recognize, for example, what is happening in Kedah. Okay, in Kedah, in the last 5 years, we have seen we have seen 2 planting seasons. I think in 2016 and 2 years ago, 2 planting seasons which were cancelled completely. Now, since there are in Kedah as well as Perlis as well as Seberang Perai, there are basically 2 planting seasons per year, and over a 5-year period, this is basically a loss of about 20% of planting. This is really very, very serious. Climate change is here with us. It is affecting our livelihoods, and especially the livelihoods of farmers. And there are a whole host of other problems which need to be addressed. Now, we are very proud, and understandably so, that this 12th Malaysia plan is the biggest plan ever in terms of the amount of money which is envisaged to be spent. But let's be very careful about about measuring progress in those terms. If you think, for example, about what is needed in, let us say, Kelantan, which is undoubtedly the poorest state in the peninsula. Do they need to solve their 3 water problems, namely lack of clean water, the so-called teh susu, which you get as drinking water in Kelantan? Do you need to solve the problems of frequent and increasingly serious floods? Do you need to solve the problem of sanitation, which is rather poor in downtown Kota Baru because of its historical the nature of its history, or do you need an ECRL? Let's remember that the railway which goes from Gemas all the way to Tumpat was not built for the people of Kelantan. It was built basically to get to the gold in Ulu Kelantan, around Kuala Krai and Gua Musang and so on and so forth. Get to the gold which was believed to be there and to take it out. Remember that the first railway which was built in this country was built between Taiping and Port Well. Okay, and the whole point was to take out the tin ore. Okay, it wasn't done because there was a particular love for the people of Taiping, or they wanted to enable many children from Port Well to go to to go to Taiping for schooling or anything like that. There was nothing of that. Undoubtedly, children did go to Taiping for schooling, and they were certainly better off for that. But let us remember what the motivation of this. So let us be very careful with what we wish for. Just wishing for more and more infrastructure to be built when almost all this infrastructure is not going to pay for itself. And worse still, some of them would have adverse health consequences, environmental consequences, and some of them are hugely problematic. When PPPs, public-private partnerships, were issued years ago to private producers, they were using diesel. What do they do now? They mainly use coal, partly because it's cheaper. But we in Malaysia are using dirty coal with sulfides and sulfates, which have disastrous consequences for the people of the country. So let us be much more skeptical about many of these things rather than be carried away with it. Let me now move to the other issue which I have been asked to speak on, namely the whole question of knowledge and learning. The late Donald Rumsfeld once said, he talked about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. But what COVID-19 has taught us, if nothing else, is that there are also what we think we know may be wrong, misknown knowns, if you will. And this, I think, is very important. So what we really need is a much more skeptical, critical view towards knowledge. And this year happens to be the centenary of the birth of the late Brazilian pedagogue, Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire revived the idea of learning through the Socratic method. And what is distinct about the Socratic method? It can be reduced down to two things. One, the dialogical approach. You learn through engagement with others, especially your peers, but also with others. And secondly, and very, very importantly, you basically learn from your life experiences and critical reflection on your life experiences. Now, Freire's ideas have been much welcomed in many parts of the world, but I do not see a serious engagement, although some of my friends translated and we published a book on the Freirean experience in Bahasa more than 3 decades ago. We really need to think of learning is not just like a savings account where you simply put in more and more and then hope for some interest that that we'll all be better off as a consequence. We look at Finland. It has consistently rated very well. It's a relatively poor country with a lot of until about 30 years ago, mainly forest resources. But what they have done with their education, not by increasing the amount of time spent in classrooms, but rather by enriching the educational experience, has been to fundamentally transform the learning experience. And that, I think, has been very, very important. So we really need to think about it. And Sun Seng started off by introducing himself as being the CEO of Teach for Malaysia. And I think this is a very important opportunity to rethink what can be done. People like him and his colleagues are actually involved on the ground in terms of trying to transform the educational experience. Let us also not become slaves of buzzwords. 12th the Malaysia Plan is full of the latest slogans and buzzwords, but not only from Washington, as used to be the case, but now also from Davos. So, Build Back Better, IR 4.0, blah, blah, blah. These are all nice sounding slogans, and they make us look very, very good. And, 2 weeks ago, Tariq Fancy who has been critical of the use of ESG, was reminding us about how problematic it is to think that we are moving forward. But this is the problem when we play catch up and we assign the writing of plans not to Malaysians who are engaged with the experience, but rather we get foreign consultants to write the latest great sounding plans. But we also know that for the last 4 decades, unfortunately, we found that planning has not really been very serious in this country. we also need to be much more careful about the policies we are signing on to, such as the CPTPP and its commitment to TRIPS, what is called TRIPS Plus, which will actually further reduce technology transfer. The late Indian journalist Raghavan, who just died a few days ago, he wrote a great deal about some of these challenges, and unfortunately, the worst case scenario which he anticipated has materialized. Now, I just have 1 minute to say something about nation building, and I don't have all that much to say. I have a lot of notes on it, but I think it is important for us to give meaning and significance to the new commitment to nation building, to national unity. This was revived about 30 years ago, but when Tun Mahathir announced Wawasan 2020, but it became a victim of the fallout in the regime at that time in 97, 98. And then, Najib revived the slogan with his One Malaysia, but it was obviously not a very serious effort. But what is important is that we need to begin to think about many of these challenges as we go forward. So the Prime Minister has challenged the nation, talking about Keluarga Malaysia. We can dismiss it as simply rhetorical, but I think we should take him very seriously take his invitation very seriously, and go beyond. Because if we see political necessity as the mother of innovation for nation building, I'm afraid we are going to be in trouble. So let's try to see what we can build with Keluarga Malaysia and going forward. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Sun Seng.
Thank you so much, Prof. Jomo, for taking us across that whole spectrum of topics, and totally agree with you. One of my favorite books on education is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and that's really the shift that needs to happen, right, where we are engaged actively and critical of our learning experience. And we're going to dive into all of this a little bit more into the panel session at this point in time, and we've got 3 really exciting panelists who will be sharing more on this idea of learning, the role of educational institutions, and as well as innovation at large in thinking about nation building. So I'm going to quickly introduce our 3 panelists, and we're then going to go into the various addresses by our panelists. So we have with us Azlina Kamal. She is the education specialist for UNICEF in Malaysia. She herself was a teacher in the Malaysian education system and has experience from the very ground all the way up to the international level, thinking about what education needs to look like and how we can move forward with that. We also have Dr. Aya. She is from the World Bank, and she is, we talk about Finland all the time. Prof. Jomo referenced Finland as well. She is from Finland, worked with the Ministry of Education and Culture at Finland. Joined by Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar, who has been, he's currently the chairman of the board at University of Technology in Malaysia, but more famously known for his role as the longest serving managing director at Khazanah Nasional, Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund, and he will join us in a bit. But over to you, Azlina, for your quick address.
Hi, everyone. I don't seem to be able to share my screen, so can someone please help me to enable the... Yes. Oh, someone's going to share it for me. Okay. Would you mind if I shared it, since I've made some adjustments to it? Okay, good. Yeah. Share window. Give me a second. Okay, I think it's okay. Let me just, Yeah, it's always one of these things, isn't it? Okay, yeah, here we go. Sinsin, can you confirm that you can see what I'm sharing? Can someone respond and tell me? I can't.
I can see Azlina.
Okay, good. You know why? Because I can't see anyone once I start sharing my screen. So hi everybody. So I've in the spirit of being a skeptic, as Prof. Jomo mentioned earlier, I've tried to rename slightly, but adhering to the theme of the session. So, you know, we know that people have talked about this in earlier sessions. COVID has exacerbated pre-existing conditions, and that has been well discussed earlier on. So I will not be talking about those. But just to say, there is also probably for us to kind of reflect on the once-in-a-generation opportunity. Is there an opportunity to transform education system? So that's what I'll be talking on today. But I wanted to start, and I'm really glad that Prof. Jomo also mentioned buzzword. Innovation is one of those buzzwords, right? So I think there are fuzzwords and buzzwords, and you know, in deconstructing development discourse analysis, Andrea Cornwall and Deborah has also mentioned this, right? So while we're talking about innovation, the ultimate goal is to improve equity and quality. And innovation is not an end in itself. So everything we do, we should divert our energies towards striving towards that goal, because there is an implicit assumption that innovation always leads to a positive disruption, or we can always leapfrog and accelerate change with innovation, and that it's necessarily tied to technology, which we know is misguided, right? So just to contextualize very quickly that these are some of the education responses that UNICEF has been involved in, with the World Bank and UNESCO, and before, during school reopenings, and also looking at recovery of education system. And I suppose, Prof. Jomo, we are also guilty of that whole building back better and reimagining education, right? So just very quickly, a snapshot, and I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that on the rightmost percentage, that we have 36% of children or students in the urban area without any gadget ownership, and 35% in the rural area, while we're talking about all the innovations that we're going to be sharing, including what I will be sharing shortly. And so, however, how can we harness technology to move towards a blended approach to learning? I'm not saying that it is a given. I'm just saying that this is an exploration, and we are also reflecting and learning as we go along. There are opportunities, you know, how maybe we can look at you know, more autonomy and independence. And for example, UNICEF is now working to expand learning platforms and looking at micro-credentialing for children in detention, for example, for undocumented children, refugee children, because of that limited access in real life that prevents them from having certain access. Would it be possible for us then to look at technology, keeping in mind all the different risks, we know that it can also exclude, but is there an opportunity, right? So I'm not going to go through it. You can look through this, because I hate when people read to me when they have slides, right? So there are opportunities. We also note that there are certain risks, that there is that preoccupation with technology rather than learning, one of it. And I think the whole commercialization of education and commodification of education as well, which will then exacerbate the digital divide further. So these are some of the strategic responses, and, you know, trying to look at innovative approaches, looking at technology for learning, and how possibly we could integrate technology in teacher education. So I'm going to be guilty of that buzzword of building back better, stronger, more inclusively, but it is an attempt, it's an aspiration, like the SDGs. It is an endeavor, right? A collective effort. And of course, we've worked with various partners on this. And I'm just going to highlight a few things where I think there is potential, but not to kind of set it up to say this is the be all and end all, right? So some of the ways in which we've tried to approach the whole COVID situation was to use it as a strategic entry point to see where we could leverage on pivoting on kind of trying to say, how do we make sure that continuity of learning happens, teachers are supported. So if you look at, I'll just highlight a few things. If you look at on the screen, community guru digital learning, we knew teachers were struggling, and we know that teachers are the first, the frontliners for education and for children to get this sense of normalcy in terms of education as a life-saving approach during emergency. And so what we did was to look at how we could help teachers manage remote learning better. And some of the things we've done is to kind of help teachers build their capacity, looking at how may they start, how can they engage students, how can assessment be done. We're trying to explore different formats. For example, we've got 25 different formats of teachers being able to use different applications that they can modify to the needs and requirements of their children. Again, the point is not the technology, the point is to help learners maintain that continuity of learning. We've also put, because we wanted to create this professional learning community online, so what teachers have done also to put all their learning materials, and there are about 1,500 learning materials now, and it's been accessed about 100,000 times, where teachers are now trying to see how do they collectively help each other to kind of maintain this continuity of learning. It's been cited as one of the global best practices, one of the promising practices in 127 countries. We're also now looking at scalability and sustainability in terms of engaging with the Bahagian Pendidikan Guru and Institute Pendidikan Guru Malaysia, right? Because we want things to be sustainable, great one-off, but how do we build systems for resilience? We've also looked at, in terms of remediation and learning loss, how can we combine essential subjects like math, science, history, geography with realign the curriculum to global citizenship education. Another danger of falling into a fuzz buzzword, but with very clear frameworks on how we're doing that. We've even have lessons on COVID so that children can look at COVID through the lenses, multidisciplinary lenses, referencing to what Prof. Jomo talked about reflecting and exercising agency during a time where children felt helpless and going through a lot of issues related to mental health. And the last bit is on future skills. Again, this is part of the curriculum, but we tweaked it so that children looked at using computational thinking to address issues around them, to look at and link it to the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are, and because children on TikTok, I'm not really a fan of all the social media sometimes, but because they're there, we thought, let's try this platform, let's explore. We've got 40,000 followers now, over 2 million views of children, just to entice them to go to the learning materials. So very quickly, some of the things we've learned from a regional perspective. We need to keep schools open. Children who are the most marginalized are the ones who rely mostly on all sorts of access to services in school. We need to look at supporting teachers. We need to look at, hybrid learning pathways as not the only way, but as part of, building resilience in the system, looking at early learning, because we know children's life chances are strengthened with early stimulation. Also at the heart of it, reaching the most marginalized children through the use of data and looking at multiple deprivation data analysis, because we know at the heart of this pandemic is a child who's poor, whose parents have lost their job, probably has a disability, lives far from school, doesn't have any gadget, has to take care of sibling. All these multiple layers of deprivation, a one-size-fits-all approach, just giving devices is not going to address the issue. Looking at protecting and prioritizing education funding and how we prioritize the spending of that, and also to look at wider system strengthening. Some countries...
we've got about a minute left.
Okay.
If you could wrap up. Thanks.
Very quickly, yeah, I'm very good speaking very quickly. So these are some of the examples in this area I mentioned earlier, where different countries in the region are already starting to have interventions to varying degrees. And this is what we hope at the end of it, for children to be ready for school at 5, to succeed at 10, and to be ready for transition at 18. So what to prioritize? Essentially 3 things. All children need to come back to school. We know even when school reopen, there are a lot of children who will not be able to make it back because of all sorts of challenges and deprivations. We need to help children catch up on lost learning, and also teachers and other stakeholders are supported. And this is what we need to do. When a grade 3 child misses 3 months of school closure, 1 year of remediation and ongoing instruction reorientation is needed, right? So moving forward, how do we reach the most marginalized? Assess, monitor learning achievement, what works, scale them up, and looking at sustainability. I'll end with this. I feel quite proud of myself that I've kind of, so these are some of the monitoring questions that we'll probably need to consider. I think it's best to end with questions rather than with answers, as we try to explore and look at ways in which we can deal with the pandemic, and in terms of how we will build back better. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Azlina, for giving us that overview, right? Really thinking about how we're rebuilding, or thinking about how we address the education disruption and learning loss, and how, and you know, that's absolutely in line with this idea, right, of the International Day of Eradication of Poverty. So next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Aya. She is the Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank Group. Over to you, Dr. Aya, for your address.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in this conference and this discussion. And many angles and important aspects that need to be kept in mind when we talk about learning and innovation have already been brought up by the previous colleagues. And the issues that I will be highlighting on my section hopefully will strengthen the message provided today and give some globally discussed aspects to the theme. When we talk about education, equity and equality need to be mentioned right at the beginning. When we build a nation, it is essential that we treat everyone as equal. So no one will be left behind, because everyone is important and everyone is needed. This principle also affects our education system and how we have to make sure that equal opportunities for learning are offered for everyone. The universal access to high quality education and training for all need to be guaranteed. And that is to ensure that all people are equipped with the skills they need in their life, both now and in the future as well. And globally, we have been happy to notice that increasingly this universal access is distributed in inclusive way using inclusive school settings. And this leads us to the concept of lifelong learning. And lifelong learning is a tool that helps people to adapt and succeed in their lives, society, and the labor market also. And it prepares us to live in a world that is shaped by technology, globalization, environmental threats, and demographic changes, as well as sudden shocks as we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. And lifelong learning includes all forms of skill and knowledge development throughout the life cycle of the individual. It answers to rapidly changing demand for different types of skills that leads us to requirement to build an education and training system where continuous upskilling and reskilling is possible and where are no dead ends in the system. To ensure that all individuals can adapt and thrive in this rapidly changing world, it is crucial that they have an opportunity to develop and improve the wide range of knowledge, skills, capabilities throughout their lives. And this skills development should be viewed with a holistic approach, focusing on equipping people with relevant skills and knowledge during the life cycle. And by this skills development, we mean a broad scope of different skills that are needed, and learning them starts from early years, and it lasts for a lifetime. And dividing skills to three dimensions is used often, and these three dimensions are, you could label them to be cognitive skills, social and behavioral skills, and then technical and job-related skills. And of course, each of these categories includes multiple and diverse detailed skills. But the important issue here is that a combination of all these skills is needed and also more and more valued by employers. Skills development takes place at all stages in life, as I already mentioned, and it starts at birth. And it continues through preschool, primary and secondary education, all the way to the higher education and on-the-job training. Some skills are learned at the school environment and some outside of the formal education system. And the younger the child is, more foundational are the skills that need to be learned at that point of age. And these different skill sets are interlinked, and learning them is cumulative, and strong support from teachers, parents, adults around our children, it is really needed. And when we teach different types of skills in formal school settings, our teaching and learning methods need to reflect those skills. So you cannot teach innovation by lecturing about it. You need to create opportunities for students to practice, create, and learn from their failures. And skills are, in many cases, best learned in real-life settings and with very practical methods. Importance of resiliency has been raised already earlier, but now the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the discussion. And resilience helps us to adjust and find solutions to different and fast-changing circumstances. These solutions are often basis for innovation. And resilience is important on different levels. There needs to be resiliency on system level and processes, and also on individual level and everyday situations. We do not know about the future. So even if we think today that we know how future will turn out, we might be proven wrong. And this is where resiliency comes to be handy. And this changing world around us screams for innovation. And innovation is not only for few, it's for all people. And skills and knowledge we have are the building blocks that support innovation. Many times we link innovation to technology or business, but it actually is needed at all the sectors of life. And the more skills you have and the more innovative you are in combining those skills, the more out-of-box solutions you will be able to create. One of the skills that has been talked a lot during the pandemic is the set of digital skills. And that, of course, rises from the school closures and remote teaching and learning practices that countries were forced to start using in a rapid and almost overnight manner. And today we are in a situation where we cannot choose anymore if we use digital tools and technology or not. Already today, but even more in the future, technology will be used both in our everyday life and in education and in working life. So technology is here to stay. And what we need to do is to decide how it is used and make sure that everyone has access and skills and knowledge and opportunity to benefit from it. That is one of the reasons why practicing these digital skills in schools is needed. And learning to use technology starts early and with small steps. The goal is to start with creating basic knowledge and positive attitudes. And it, however, needs to be kept in mind that there are skills such as creativity and social emotional skills that are easier to learn in person and in contact with others. And that is why hybrid models are needed. The positive thing is that digitalization and using the technological tools has brought us, people from different locations and countries, together. And we are facing our individual and local challenges, but many of the obstacles we run into are shared. So it is encouraging and comforting to notice that we are not alone, but instead we can be learning, developing, and innovating together as a global community. So this is where I would like to end this part of the section from my part. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aya. And you touched a lot on skills development, and 93% of the audience in the poll, agreed that education should focus on the development of skills. So we've just had a deep dive with the last two panelists around education. And next up we have Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar. And, I think we're going to explore this whole nation building piece a little bit more as it comes on. So over to you, Tan Sri.
Yeah, thank you, Sun Seng. How much time are you giving me? I can adjust.
Technically, you have 8 minutes, Tan Sri.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, I think while the topic is on learning and innovation, and organizers, thank you. You've also captioned me as chairman of UTM, which I am. But I think as I look through the whole schedule and from what Sun Seng's introduction, I think I can hopefully contribute the most by trying to complement. I think my colleagues, Azlina and Aya, has already given a lot on education, so I won't add too much. Indeed, learning and innovation, we can't argue with that, right? So really, maybe I'll focus on the catalyst to nation building part with respect to the theme, or rather the context of eradicating poverty. So I got 3 key points in saying, if I may. The first is maybe I'll just share the obvious business and finance angle, of which I spent the great part of my career doing. Indeed, just to highlight, for those of us who always believe in a conception of business to be one which has responsibility beyond business, it was maybe 10, 15 years ago a rather lonely fight to do that, because the prevailing philosophy, as you know, was the role of business was to do business. But the last few years, especially, you can see quite a sea change in terms of thinking, that indeed now we talk about stakeholder economy rather than just a shareholder economy. Now, of course, it is correct to be skeptical or even cynical on this, because indeed the entrenched interest of business is very deep, and finance even more so. But I think we cannot and should not ignore, and we must try and capture and overcome the so-called greenwashing around ESG and SDG, and we should capture that wave. And I think all along, for many of us who believe that businesses, like any other parts of society, have a moral responsibility on the society that they serve, whether as consumers or workers and so on and so forth, right? So I think that's the first point, that we should capture that. And in that regard, really the job of businesses is, because awareness has gone up a lot, the issue now is how to move from awareness to action to authenticity, right? So we are at that phase, not just on climate, but on the S in the ESG, and indeed on the G itself. And I think in that regard, for example, one obvious one, if we define learning as lifelong learning and innovation as not just creating the next unicorn, but also about how can we innovate for the benefit of society, i.e. socio-economic innovation, not just commercial innovation, then really businesses have a lot of resources and expertise, right? And it starts with creating jobs and good jobs and the relationship between capital and labor. So for example, here in Malaysia, our official minimum wage is 1,200 ringgit, whereas Bank Negara, our central bank, estimates that living wage in 2018 at least was 2,700 ringgit. So there's a big gap. In some countries, the living wage movement has started. Some companies like Unilever and others have taken the lead. So I think we really need to close this gap because one, creation of jobs, two, jobs that pay properly. I read a World Bank report recently that I believe something like at least about 8% of those who are technically considered poor by the bank, $1.90 per day, about 8% actually of those actually have jobs. So just having a job doesn't necessarily mean you're not poor, which basically then brings about the question of the relationship between capital and labor. So I think this is obviously the first point, the role of business. Secondly, the role of state. I understand Prof. Jomo has highlighted this. I think RMK12 has just come out. Nice, thick document, but obviously the devil is in the implementation and the details. But I would echo the point that I think Malaysia has just turned 64 recently, right? So if we were a person, 64 is quite young. I think the Beatles created a song about being 64. But as a nation, I think that's not very old. Nonetheless, at the first 40 odd years, we did pretty well in terms of eradicating poverty. But perhaps there's a trend of too much outsourcing and privatization and getting that balance wrong, not just from a financial standpoint, but from a capability standpoint is I think the point that I believe Prof. Jomo was highlighting, which is we must have embedded strength and capability, because if you start outsourcing everything, the plans, let alone the implementation, then there comes a day when everything becomes hollow and we don't have the so-called embedded strength or embedded autonomy in order to implement these things, right? So the role of the state, I think, is important. I think the issue of taxation, for example, so the taxation and then the spending of that taxation. There's a lot of discussion around universal basic income, as somebody has pointed out, perhaps to think through not just UBI, which is a subject that labor economists and other things a lot about, but universal basic services, which is, I think, one of the core roles of the state, right? To be able to provide core basic services from education to healthcare, and then, moving up the need and the aspirational kind of a ladder in that regard, right? But perhaps another aspect of, I think, the role of the state especially is, before we do good, we should do good, is can we remove some of the obstacles and the harm? Fighting corruption, for example, taking down cartels, making sure that regionalism doesn't take over in terms of the governance and politics. So I note the recent RMK12, for example, 8 out of the 10 poorest districts in Malaysia in Sabah. The other one lodging is in Kelantan and another one in Sarawak. So to the extent that we have a My Kasih system, for example, we must do proper My Kasih, not in the Malay term Pilih Kasih, so to speak, right? And finally, between role of business and role of state is then the so-called third sector, civil society. Again, I think, and here I just wanted to end on the role of institutions, and in a way this is a form of innovation. I note this conference is jointly organized by Yayasan Sejahtera, of which 12 years ago, I think I was privileged to as a CEO of Khazanah, we created Yayasan Sejahtera, which actually even predated Yayasan Hasanah. So in a way, Sejahtera's mission was to address poverty, and we were able to institutionalize this, and I'm particularly pleased 12 years on, and long may it continue. So KRI, for example, the Research Institute, has a focus on looking at inequality in all its various forms and dimensions. So to the extent that as we do all this, I think to echo and perhaps build on the theme of building the embedded strength and autonomy and capability is really to build institutions that will outlast, because obviously this is a long game. Got a lot more to talk about learning and innovation, but perhaps I'll stop there, Sun Sing. Thank you.
Thanks, Tantri. That was very concise. So we're going to go into Q&A at this point in time. So we'd like to invite the rest of the speakers up onto the virtual stage with me. And for the audience members, you can use the Q&A tab to share your questions with us. So would like to go right back to the beginning. And so I think the first question is addressed to Prof. Jomo. And the question says, all these steps towards economic inclusivity is possible, or the question is, are all these steps towards economic inclusivity possible without addressing corruption, nepotism, and double standards?
Well, there's no short answer to such a complex range of issues raised by that understandably short question. I think all good things do not necessarily go together, and you can have many societies which are formally corrupt and societies which are informally corrupt, in the sense that there are no rules prohibiting all kinds of actions from taking place. Recently, we have heard politicians, for example, arguing that certain things are not unacceptable from a religious point of view because they are not specified in the holy books, and so on and so forth. So we don't want to get into that kind of discussion, because there is a great deal of abuse which goes on in the system, in all kinds of systems. But I would obviously take the view that obviously we want to get rid of corruption. But I think we should not have a very narrow view of what constitutes corruption. Is influence peddling corruption? I would argue that it is. But there may not be rules in any particular society which prohibit that kind of influence peddling. So I think it's important to recognize that very often there may be the infringement of rules in the interest of innovation, of doing things better, and so on and so forth. Rules are often reflect power and influence of the past. They are not designed to facilitate innovation, and so on and so forth. And very often these guidelines can become a fetter, and you can often game systems. Tan Sri Azman just referred to ESG, for example. 2 weeks ago at the Kazana Megatrends Forum, Tariq Fancy reminded us of his critique of ESG. You can have the nicest of things, specified in the name of ESG, but you can obviously game the system. Let's take, for example, what's happening today with the pandemic. Now that it's endemic, pharmaceutical companies see a huge opportunity to make a great deal of money continuing to sell booster shots, etc., etc. But there is no incentive in the present scheme of things to actually eradicate COVID-19. I mean, this is a perverse system in which we live. So you can actually have a dysfunctionality built into the system with all the best of intentions. Okay, supposedly you have intellectual property rights to encourage innovation, etc., etc. But this is a perverse consequence of a system which has been designed in such a way. So I think it is very important for us to recognize that corruption obviously is a problem, but what one means by corruption often differs depending on who's talking. A lawyer talking about corruption would have a very, very different view, and often different groups with different cultural backgrounds and different norms might also have rather different views of this. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Tan Sri Azman, would you add anything to that?
Not really. I think I would support that. The angle I was trying to take on corruption was often we tend to focus on 20 things let's try and do, right? So doing good, which is good, but in my my hunch and my, I suppose, experience suggests actually removing the harm in the first place is probably a much higher so-called return that you can get from the effort, right? So for example, in this case, if you say that you want to give universal basic services, as you know, A lot of basic services were impacted when government finances were constrained, even pre-pandemic, partly because of the issues around financial scandals and bad spending, right? And as Prof. Jomo said, yeah, I mean, obviously corruption, in this context, just like poverty, we should take a broader definition because the problem is multidimensional and you have to solve it holistically. So the only angle I would add is really, there's a Malay saying, buat baik pada, buat jahat jangan sekali. How do I translate that? That means do good in moderation, but never ever do bad things, right? Which I think basically, the first rule is, remove, do no harm. I think we need to remove, and what are the 2 or 3 big injustices in our system? Is it, corruption in all its definition, cartels, for example. I think the whole labor market reforms and all the underneath there, there's a lot of vested interest, which actually, and all this affects poverty or inequality. In the latest report, we note that, about 50%, I think, is considered, this is not my statistic, this is CPU, are basically vulnerable households. When KRI does a survey about how much, savings people have, right? I think something, if I'm not mistaken, Prof, the 500 ringgit or whatever it was, the majority of society cannot handle, a shock impacting 500 ringgit. When petrol prices go up, or rather, why is the queue when people calculate that you may save 10 ringgit? Well, 10 ringgit matters. That's why there's a long queue last time and so on. So I think the whole issue around the precariat or the so-called debts of despair. I'm not an expert on poverty, and I learned from Prof. Jomo and others. But I think the insights of Banerjee and Duflo, I think this is the RCTs and so on, is back to the point again. I think we need to recapture those embedded strength and capability among us. Actually, this is how we made progress in the first 40, 45 years, especially in the country, right? In education, in poverty eradication. And I think the time has come, actually. This is now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tan Sri. Dr. Ayat, you spoke about equality and equity as a focus in education, and both Prof. Jomo and Tan Sri spoke about our outsourcing sometimes of the thinking of nation building and development to whether it's foreign consultants or just foreign talent, right? And so this next question comes from Nur Zalifa, and she's asking, how do we address equitable access to all levels of communities and ensuring inclusive suggestions from locals, following their actual needs and not assumptions in order to accelerate innovations? So, open that up to the floor. Dr. Ayat, do you want to go first?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to say something about the issue that is very broad, as we all know. But I think that what is important to keep in mind that every country is different. And every country's education system is a product of the culture, the history, and the needs of the nation. So it's not possible to say that there is one universal thing that needs to be done, but we need to understand that there are elements that are important, and then every country needs to kind of figure out how the elements will fit their system and circumstances. So, but what countries usually find to be kind of a common and shared is that if we build an education system that is good for the marginalized and the children who are have the less possibilities and the parents that have the less possibilities to provide for their children, if we make the system sustainable so it benefits the poorest and vulnerable ones, then the system is also good quality and also serves for all the students. So I think that is one of the key basic elements. And the second thing we need to always keep in mind is that we have a kind of a joint will to work for all people. So we do not build systems that are accessible only for few, but we build systems that are both in reach, we think about different states or rural areas or children with disabilities, and we need to make sure that they have first the physical access to education, but after that also emotional and social access. So we need to build the learning culture and kind of the operational culture in the whole community, so everybody can be part and everyone can be included. And after that umbrella, we can start building the details and do maybe and hopefully then individualized and personalized solutions. So this in short.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Aya. And you know, I think that there's a piece about how our education system is structured. Prof. Joma, you spoke about the banking model, right? Freri's banking model, and oftentimes our Malaysian system is very much, there is a person in authority who knows the answers, and our job is then to learn from those who are more wise. And as we need to flip that, right? As we think about community-based development, if we think about equity and voices of our community informing national development, how do we ensure that from an education system perspective, our students feel that their voice matters, our students feel that they are set up to contribute, right? So maybe to add on from the nation building perspective, Prof. Tan Sri, how do we get communities more involved? How do we elevate the voices of those? And, you know, to Dr. Aya's point, how do we design for some of the most marginalized in order to lift the overall floor for everybody?
Sorry, Sun Seng, who is that directed to?
Why don't you start, Prof?
Well, I think the question you pose is extremely challenging, because we obviously cannot have, for want of a better term, a cultural revolution in education without the rest of society changing. But I think I take heart in the fact that the Prime Minister of the country today is probably the one with the most Marhain credentials ever. Okay, and we, you know, and this I think is undoubtedly promising. And his elder brother just set up a new political party ostensibly committed to Marhainism. Now, for those who don't understand what Marhainism is, it refers to it basically is a sort of a populist ideology, if you will, which Sukarno invented in the 1950s, which refers to enhancing the situation of the smaller people, the people below. Let me put it that way. Now, what that actually means in the present context is quite ambiguous, and this is why I think that while the 12th Malaysia Plan has got a lot of good innovations, especially on the sustainability front, most of the actual targets are so far away in the future that I don't actually see what is going to happen in the near term. And this is why I think it is important for us to address the here and now, as well as what is likely to happen in the future. So if we recognize, as many people do these days, that COVID-19 is probably endemic until there is a breakthrough, and that we will have to live with this, we obviously need to work with that. Now, COVID-19 probably accelerated digitalization of life in our society. The very fact that we're having this meeting, this conference, not in person, but in this way, is testimony to how things have changed. But if you do not have appropriate policies, for almost a full year, in Malaysia was, the children were expected to learn remotely through digital means. And we also knew very, very early on that only about 6% of school children actually had access to digital means. So there we were, not relying on historical resources. I mean, various people, including Tan Sri Azman's late father, were involved in education television. which was an important feature for the last third of the 20th century and went on into the early part of the 21st century. But we took it, it was only at the beginning of this year that once again, education television was used. We obviously don't seem to be able to be very agile, in terms of adjusting to new challenges and new situations. So I would like to think that, for example, in dealing with the questions of poverty, I mean, whatever the official numbers are, I think we can always add a significant number more, because the costs of living today are not exact. We're not comparing like with like when you compare with 50 years ago, because you have to pay much more for services. You have to pay much more for simple things like public transportation and so on and so forth. All this has fundamentally changed our lives. So what does it mean when you have relief measures which are designed for those who already have jobs, but not particularly designed, for example, for people in the informal sector? And the majority of people in Malaysia's labor force are actually in informal employment, including self-employment, rather than in the formal sector. And so what does it mean that you ask them to dip their already meager savings? Tan Sri Azman referred to this earlier. The savings for more than 80% of the population, they do not have enough EPF savings. Sorry, for those EPF account holders, they do not have enough in their savings to live above the poverty line upon retirement. And this should be very, very troubling. So we obviously have a lot of inadequacies. We are on the cusp of becoming a high-income country. But what does it really mean for ordinary people? The income of this country has increased sixfold since the beginning of the new economic policy period. Sixfold. But obviously, it is not a case of the rising tide lifting most boats. Obviously, there are many boats which are not only leaking, the precariat, to use Tan Sri Azman's term, but also many more who don't even have boats to hang on to. So we are living in but that analysis of the conditions and the determinants of their poverty can only come about through a determined effort, not only to look at the specificities of their condition, but also the larger environment in which we all find ourselves. So it is a very challenging thing which you pose, and I do hope that this new era will open up new opportunities for us to move forward together.
Thanks, Prof.
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to quickly add, the question is about how to get communities more involved. I just wanted to highlight one thing that we did last time, as you know, on the Trust School program, right? And to highlight, maybe for Aya's information, you may know, we kind of studied the charter schools in the United States, right? So whereby there's 10,000 schools in Malaysia. We say we can't boil the ocean, and we're not sure whether doing instant Maggi mee is good enough. So perhaps the better metaphor is to do like acupuncture, right? Where can we unblock certain things? So we decided let's do 200. I think after I left, I believe they're doing about 200 or 300 out of 10,000. So not very much. However, the demonstration effect, I think, is quite high. But just now that I'm out of Khazanah, I think I can share this anecdote. So at one meeting with very senior people, they said, "Good, you're making progress. Why don't you do 2,000 schools?" I said, "Sorry, that's not my job. That's your job. That I think the government has to do it. Our job was to bring whatever resources we had, as part of the embedded government, I suppose, and then to try and find those acupuncture points. For an investment house like Khazanah, we actually ignored possible investment with 30% IRRs into private education, because that would actually widen the gap, and secondly, it would probably crowd out the private sector if you don't want to get involved. But I think you have to choose. In other words, what I'm trying to say is choose your moments. Bring the power of networks and collaboration. So saying, as you know, TFM was also something that we supported. So we created all these layers for what it's worth. And indeed, I think now that the whole ESG, SDG thing, I think there will be a lot of scrutiny from what Tariq Fancy and other people are saying, so-called whistleblowers, about whether businesses are really serious, and you can expect that this will continue, and that's a good thing. Then I think eventually it will sift through into being more authentic, and that's the moment to capture, right? And I think therefore the power of collaborating and networking, because I think just hoping for businesses, obviously that's not really their core job. Governments, as you know, Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken, when I sat on some of these education reform councils, I believe the number was 8% of GDP was how much we spend on education, which was double the world average, more or less. So whether that's the heart in the right place or we are very inefficient, probably a bit of both, to be fair. So I think, so the key point was, you need to, in a way, innovate and collaborate and basically build and break those and to use the metaphor of somehow pick your spots like acupuncture. Thank you.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, it's the role of all of those three actors, right, in enabling those things and working together towards that. And we'll hear more about trust schools later on in Plenary 4. Azlina, for the last question, I think really on this theme of equity and inclusivity comes from Yana Karim from the previous plenary. And so she is proposing that MOE includes disability studies into school and the university curriculum with the hopes that it will increase disability awareness, following the rights model instead of the charity model. And so I guess what are your thoughts about disability studies and how the education system is set up to include students of that kind?
I think I'll unpack it from a few different perspectives. I think I agree that, for the most part, when we talk about disability, we talk about it from a medical model lens rather than a social model, right? So it's almost like a diagnosis and the child is that, and that's finite, rather than looking at how we support the child. For example, someone taught me the easiest thing. I now can't read without my glasses, right? No one's going to segregate me just because I can't read without my glasses. We look at ways in which we try to support and include the child. But the problem also then is with the whole issue of stigma and discrimination, and we don't have a lot of children or parents of children with disability registering children. Because there's this prevalent stigma, and as a result, when it comes to policy, when it comes to disbursements of fund, resources, human, financial, it's always skewed because it doesn't seem like it's a big enough problem because of this registration, because of the numbers, right? And I think Prof. Jomo earlier talked a little bit about the dangers of having numbers as a yardstick to social measures and social action. So the way that UNICEF has worked, normalizing disability is very important. And so we're doing that in various ways. We've come up with a publication quite a number of years ago on childhood disability, trying to explore all the different issues and the reasons as to what's preventing children from accessing not just education but all sorts of services, and how the legal framework also prejudices. There are certain prejudices within the legal framework as well. We are working towards the way in which we're working. One is through the inclusive education roadmap. That's one way in which we are actually providing technical input to the government. We're looking at exploring disability through our global citizenship education realigned curriculum. We're also looking at, for example, certain innovations like future skills, for example. We're having our friends from Malaysia Federation of the Deaf who are signing for us today. They're going to get children to actually be sign language interpreters, for example, to also put children in the front and center, and to normalize disability. We've got accessibility features that we're utilizing. That's how we're trying to use technology to be inclusive. So there are various ways in which we're looking at this. So I would agree completely. I think in general, we need to move beyond this welfarist agenda. Especially when people speak about disability, there's always this, oh my God, we're all going to go to heaven, we need to help. And I really have a problem with this, because what you inherently do is that you position children with disability as subjects to be pitied, right? And so whatever provisions we then do, we do out of sympathy and out of welfare. And I think a more developmental model in terms of how we respond to the issue is needed. I'll stop there because I'm also conscious of time.
Yeah. Thank you, Azlina, and that's really about all the time that we have for today. And I just want to say thank you so much to each and every one of you for contributing to this discussion. Obviously, a very broad and complicated issue, right? But we've learned about the power of local innovation, really, and how we need to leverage on that and really drive that, and thinking about how across the sector, right, whether it's the role of business, whether it's the role of government, whether it is the role of civil service societies or organizations, and finally, really, we've talked about the idea of equity and inclusion, in ensuring that we are that everyone's voice matters and comes to the table, and that we are developing to bring everyone forward, right, especially as we think about eradication of poverty. So thank you so much once again to all of our speakers today, and I'm going to pass the session back to our MC, Rauda. So off to you, Rauda, and thank you so much again, everyone, for being with us this morning.
Thank you so very much, Sunsing. And well, hello everybody, I'm back. Sorry, I had a little bit of a technical glitch earlier, just like Dr. Ken, but I am back. So it was a really incredible panel. I was lucky enough to actually be in. And so the technical issues sort of just swift away, and I actually listened to the discussion. So it was really good. And I was also in touch with one of our attendees today who actually mentioned that the discussion was indeed arousing. So thank you so very much, Sunsing, and all the panelists. All right, everybody. So looking at the time, it is 12:30 p.m. I'm pretty sure some of you are hungry. And as I understand, some of our Muslim mail also has got to go to the Jummah prayers. So what we will be doing now is we'll be taking a small, relatively small lunch break. I do hope everybody can come back at about 2:15 p.m. So the next session will begin at 2:30. And so we do hope that everybody can come at 2:15. If you can come earlier at 2 p.m., that would be perfect, just to ensure that everything is smooth. Now, I'm sure all of you are excited for the afternoon session. We will be having the minister in the Prime Minister's department in to give the special keynote speech as well. So that will be right after lunch. Now, before I let all of you go, there is an important announcement for me to make. Now that it is lunch break, the networking lounge as well as the exhibition booths are all now open. So feel free to connect, feel free to chat with the representatives that are there. And in fact, our inspiring speaker earlier, Yana Karim from Bole Space, will also be there at the lounge. So feel free to connect with her and feel free to leverage on all the features that are available today. All righty, so I think that is all from me. Before we go on to the lunch break, I will meet all of you at 2:15 or 2 p.m. if you can come in earlier, and we'll resume later. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.